Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the DGAP morning briefing. I'm Henning, Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which was the reason for us to launch these briefings, enters day 748, 2 years, 20 days. This morning, we will be looking into the Franco-German split that emerged over Ukraine's strategy last month. On the morning of February the 26th, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz for the first time publicly explained his no to the delivery of the Taurus cruise missile into Ukraine, arguing that this would involve something, quote, France and the United Kingdom can do, but Germany cannot, i.e. putting boots on the ground, German soldiers who would help with target programming. Later that day, at a conference in Paris of more than 20 European heads of state and government, including Olaf Scholz, to demonstrate continued support to Ukraine, French President Emmanuel Macron did not rule out sending Western troops. Making the case for strategic ambiguity, Macron said inter alia, quote, "Nothing is ruled out. We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war. The defeat of Russia is indispensable to the security and stability in Europe," unquote. Hours later, Chancellor Scholz shot back and did rule out sending NATO troops, later corrected to German troops, also on social media, which some interpreted as laying the groundwork for a SPD election campaign theme. Macron then used a speech in Prague to press his case again, saying this was not the time for cowardice. And indeed, it seems there are some reports that the French Chief of Staff of the military, Chief of Staff, Thierry Burkhardt, had sounded out NATO allies weeks before about their willingness possibly to send troops which would do things like training in Ukraine, demining, and other occupation. Overall, Macron's move seemed not popular within NATO, but is appreciated by a number of Northern and Eastern European countries, notably Poland. Things have calmed down somewhat since, and tomorrow, Weimar Triangle Summit in Berlin with Chancellor Scholz, President Macron, and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk offers a chance to draw a line and move forward. Nonetheless, we want to use this morning briefing to look deeper into this Franco-German rift, and we have a great panel to discuss it. I have the pleasure of welcoming Sylvie Kauffmann, editorial director and columnist of Le Monde newspaper. Sylvie is a seasoned international affairs commentator and author of the recent book Les Aveugles, about French and German blindness vis-à-vis Vladimir Putin's Russia. Welcome, Sylvie.
Good morning.
We have also with us Nico Lange, senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference. He is one of the most perceptive observers of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and one of the most insightful commentators on the Western response to it. He served inter alia as Chief of Staff at the German Defense Ministry from 2019 to 2021. And I'd like to draw your attention to an article Nico Lange wrote last year for IP and IPQ, which I'll share in the chat in a moment, on site-invented blind spots. Good morning and welcome, Nico Lange. And last but not least, we have with us Jakob Ross, Research Fellow for France and Franco-German Relations here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining DGAP, Jakob inter alia served at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels and the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Quai d'Orsay. Like Sylvie, he's joining us from Paris, which currently hosts something of an alternative Munich Security Conference, also known as the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum. Good morning, Jakob.
Good morning.
To start us off, each speaker will give a short input, Jakob on Macron's new line, Nico Lange on Scholz's response, and Sylvie on the state of the Franco-German relationship in general. After some discussion on the panel, about 30 minutes in, we will be opening for your questions and comments. Some quick housekeeping remarks for the Q&A. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question in person to the panel. You're also welcome to submit questions and comments via the chat function. Please note that this briefing is recorded and on the record, and that we have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. And with a word of thanks to Jan Stöckmann, the head of the Director's Office, and to the DGAP Central Eastern European expert Milan Nitsch, who keep these briefings running, as well to our colleagues in the events and communication teams. Let's start with Jakob, please.
Thank you, Henning, and thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. I would like to kick it off with a couple of thoughts on Macron's response on this troops on the ground question at the conference Henning referred to on 26 February, and would like to witness to the fact that these discussions are currently ongoing in Paris at the Defense and Strategy Forum. Yesterday, the Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda opened the forum stating that, quote, "We need to open new perspectives," just as President Macron did. So you could interpret that he was referring to this boots on the ground controversy. Now, with his response regarding this question of Western ground troops in Ukraine, as Henning said, Macron wanted to restore a certain level of strategic ambiguity, make it harder for Putin to control the escalation game in Ukraine and to predict the next move of Western allies. As such, you said it, Henning, it was welcomed by many, I think, including NATO allies, especially the Eastern allies, however, often behind closed doors, not necessarily publicly. So in that sense, Macron and France really played their traditional role as controversial door openers within NATO to ideas that some allies might have thought about, but nobody wanted to raise so far. Now, the problem was, I think, that Macron's message was not only ambiguous towards Russia, but also towards his own allies within NATO and the European Union. First of all, it remains unclear to this day what exactly ground troops mean. Forces operating behind the line in supporting roles such as logistics, mine clearing, reconnaissance, or combat troops on the front line in the East. Next, these discussions were never meant to be public. The Chancellery apparently had insisted on this before the conference, threatening or messaging at least clearly to Paris that they would have to disagree publicly if Macron would take this to the public. Macron chose to do otherwise, to answer the question during the press conference, to confirm these discussions. So it was a deliberate choice in a certain sense to escalate this discussion. I would add, however, and that became clear in the German discussion in the media, but also in the expert discussion, that the fact that it was Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister, who had initially brought this into the public right before the start of this conference should have raised questions to my mind, given his close links reportedly to Moscow. Anyway, Macron made the statement. It provoked a strong reaction that Nico Lange will expand on afterwards, and a new rift in the Franco-German relationship that we hope will be addressed at the Weimar meeting in Berlin tomorrow. Now, before handing over to Nico, I would like to rapidly contextualize Macron's statements on the troops in Ukraine. I think that they came as a part of a calculated effort of repositioning France vis-à-vis its Eastern European allies and play a stronger role within NATO at the eastern flank. Since May of last year and Macron's speech in Bratislava at the GLOBSEC conference, there's a coordinated effort within French diplomacy and security policy circles to do so, to reposition France, sometimes referred to as the Bratislava Agenda. I think the centerpiece of this agenda is the new French support for Ukraine's NATO membership, a big shift compared to historic French positions. It also includes more military presence on the ground in eastern flank within NATO through air policing that has been there for decades now, maritime presence, but also ground troops and growing levels of ground troops in Estonia, and especially in Romania, where France is leading a NATO battle group. This effort is partly a reaction to the Chancellor's claim, Olaf Scholz's claim, to conventional military leadership in what he called Mitteleuropa in the Prague speech in late summer of 2022. And the French fear of losing out to Germany, getting sidelined by German policies in a region that has traditionally played not such a big role for Paris. The Bratislava agenda comes at an interesting moment in time for France as well, since Paris has, in parallel of strengthening troop levels on NATO's eastern flank, pulled out a lot of resources of Western Africa, where it was forced to do so in some countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and decided to do so deliberately in others, in Senegal, in Gabon, in Côte d'Ivoire. So there's a big question in France whether yes or no, there's some kind of a strategic pivot to Europe, you could call it, away from, say, Western Africa or the Indo-Pacific and towards allied defense in Europe. French officials have publicly denied that it is indeed a pivot, but others say otherwise behind closed doors. So we will see. We will publish a policy brief on that question soon. If this was, and I will end with this, indeed a strategic shift in French foreign and security policy, it would have huge consequences, not only for French foreign and European policy, but for the balance of power, if you will, within the European theater. To my mind, it is the only way for President Macron in the remaining 3 years of his presidency to take leadership in European security and defense, to make his initial claim from 2017 to European sovereignty credible. And he tried to signal through nuclear policy and by encouraging debates about the European dimension of French nuclear deterrence in the past that he wanted to have this leadership role. But the only way to be taken seriously, I think, by Poland and other Eastern allies are French boots on the ground, not in Ukraine, but in the neighboring countries. But as you can imagine, and I will end with this, there are many opposing interests in France, so this shift is not certain at all at this point. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jakob. Let's move on to Nico Lange, please. Comments on the German response.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this debate. Let's start with keeping the eye on the ball. I mean, it seems to me that this is the biggest problem in all this, within Germany, but also in the German-French debate. We make every problem very quickly a problem about ourselves, and then it's not about helping Ukraine anymore. It's just about what is the French position, what is the German position, or what are positions within the German position. We are very good at that. But the key issue here is how to help Ukraine defending itself, how to help Ukraine winning the war. And from this point of view, let's just state the facts that Germany and France quite recently have signed bilateral security assistance agreements with Ukraine. There is a lot of critique towards these agreements, but on the other hand, I think there is a lot of substance within the agreements. The agreements also provide a framework for industrial and technological cooperation, which is a path that is very important to Ukraine. If you see the German companies and the French companies that are talking to Ukraine about maintenance and repair of weapon systems closer to the front lines, about possible common production of equipment and of ammunition in Ukraine, I think that's a substantive step forward. Also, I believe the German-French debate on Ukraine may have culminated in what we have seen in the last weeks, but there have been difficulties for quite a long time now. I do not want to go into personal differences and why people don't like each other, but I think we can just say, okay, all involved people should be adult enough to overcome this kind of personal disliking and just work in the interest of the overarching goals. Seems to be a bit difficult for both of them, but that's not, maybe we will see more of that tomorrow. And if we talk about the Weimar Triangle meeting tomorrow, I think that's a quite remarkable development, because I think some of you, at least those who were and observed Munich Security Conference, were extremely critical that this Weimar Triangle meeting did not happen during Munich Security Conference some weeks ago, and that the chance to address the question, how do the Europeans proceed if things in the US would get difficult when it comes to support for Ukraine, was not addressed at that moment in time. I understand that the meeting taking place tomorrow in Berlin is a reaction to the critique, and it's a good sign that finally this is getting together, and maybe the errors are corrected to some extent. Having said all that, just maybe two more remarks. One on troop presence, or the discussion about ground troops. I think in the discussion of bilateral security assistance agreements, Ukraine is negotiating 32 of those bilateral security assistance agreements, and some of them have been concluded. It was always clear that some countries in their assistance to Ukraine are ready to go further than others. And it has always been part of the discussion that some countries would say, we are ready, if the conditions are right, to train Ukrainian troops with our trainers on Ukrainian ground. We are ready to think about extended air defense assistance, where we could imagine also to be present on the ground in Ukraine. We can think about support troops helping with forward logistics to give some relief to the armed forces of Ukraine, so that they can free resources to use them on the front lines. And all of this makes a lot of sense. And I'm in the context of helping Ukraine, I think it's a meaningful discussion. The problem that we have now is that because of what President Macron said on the day of his summit, and how it was perceived, it led to domestic discussions in many of the involved countries of the Paris summit, where they had to exclude and deny and have to say, no troops on the ground, making, I think, a meaningful discussion more difficult now. What I found absolutely unnecessary, to say this very bluntly, what I found absolutely unnecessary was the German Chancellor tweeting directly to deny something the French president just had said. I think there are many ways to express differences, but it's totally unnecessary to have this kind of frontal contradiction and to have tweets about this for purely domestic reasons. I mean, it just follows the lines, oh, we deliver tanks, but no planes. Oh, we do this, but no ground troops. It's domestic pressure that forces, it seems to me, that forces the Chancellor to do statements like this. And it's not even domestic pressures from the public at large. If you follow polls in Germany, it seems to be domestic pressure from the constituency in the SPD parliamentary group that forces the Chancellor to make statements like that and to close doors to, I think, necessary discussions for helping Ukraine. Moving forward, and that's the last point, I think there are meaningful initiatives that could be led by Germany and France that could help Ukraine further. One point being maintenance and repair closer to the front lines, the involvement of industries to help Ukraine to produce more. The second being, if you see how the Czech president was able to buy ammunition on global markets, it seems to be there is ammunition, equipment, possible help for Ukraine out there. France and Germany do have purchasing power and market power to look around in the world and to be more pragmatic. And if you see how difficult it is to open new production lines and what the timelines are for new production, and if you see how much more pragmatically and quickly you can buy stuff on global markets, I think there could be a German-French effort. And the last point, Ukraine is very good now in developing their drone production and their missile production, and to have domestically produced Ukrainian drones and missiles as a part of resisting Russian aggression. There will be the question of components and parts of this being delivered for mass production in Ukraine. And I think Germany and France could be a core of initiative where the European Union and the European countries use their big market leverage to help Ukraine with this technological and industrial foundation. I hope that will be a discussion of the Weimar Triangle tomorrow. And I also hope, and that's my last remark, that Donald Tusk, with his experience as being president of the European Council, moderating very difficult, different interests, and being a very mature leader, is able to moderate the differences also in the German-French relationship. And I think it's a positive development to have Donald Tusk together with Macron and Scholz tomorrow. And maybe we talk about differences now, but maybe we have to talk less about this already tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Nico Lange. I indeed also saw the comments about the Polish role as a sort of marriage counselor now to the Franco-German couple. So fingers crossed for Donald Tusk to use his sort of known diplomatic finesse to get the two together again. Sylvie, of course, also is a long time observer of this relationship, and we would like to turn to her now for her sort of putting it in a wider perspective.
Yes,
Sylvie,
good
please.
morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. Well, I think it was obvious on February 24, 2022, that this war was going to have a huge impact on the Franco-German relationship, because we have to go back a little bit and look at the background of this war and of our relationship. There was always a fundamental difference between France and Germany's priority and identity, if I may say it this way. France, I mean, this sounds as cliches, but maybe we have to remind ourselves of this, that France, former colonial empire, nuclear power, member of the P5, looking at its armed forces as the backbone of its projection of power. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with France, you know that Bastille Day is the day where we have this huge parade on the Champs-Élysées, and this is really a ritual since when I was a child. Every July 14, we sat down in front of the TV set and spent 2 hours watching this parade in amazement. And I think most French families have always been doing this. So that says something about the way we relate to our armed forces. And in this respect, I think, and also as we French claim to have a global vision, and try to implement it. So in this way, we are closer, I think, to the British culture than to the German one. And for Germany, as we see it here, Germany is much more of a pacifist society, of course, anti-nuclear. You remember in the 80s, during the Euro missile crisis, the pacifist movement was very strong in Germany. It was almost non-existent in France. And François Mitterrand used to say the missiles are in the east and the pacifists are in the west, right? But this was not so much an issue in France. And so this difference evolved in the last 2 decades into two complementary models, I would say, with Germany being the economic powerhouse in Europe, the economic engine of the EU, and France, trying to push its geopolitical ambitions, its security agenda, this idea of strategic autonomy for Europe. And that was more or less comfortable for France. I think France always had a chip on its shoulder about the economic power of Germany. I think France also mostly followed the German line on its policy towards Russia. Thought that was the German priority. And there was also another difference, I think, that was constant was the relationship to the US. And that's an important factor, I think. Also, it was very obvious during the Donald Trump's term when Trump, of course, picked on Angela Merkel and on Germany much more than on France. And because he realized that the crisis in the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, was much more difficult to bear for Germany than to France. And this is also a factor of our problems today. I mean, this difference of view in the relationship with the United States. So the war in Ukraine, in a way, blurred a lot of those differences. Germany was much more shaken than France by the war because its relationship with Russia was deeper than the Franco-Russian relationship. And of course, there was also the issue of energy dependency. So Chancellor Scholz made his Zeitenwende speech, which was, I think France was very impressed by this. But France didn't have to do this publicly, at least, this Zeitenwende turnaround, because the shock was maybe less brutal for France. But France has had to reckon that its military model is unfit for a continental war, and I think Jacob has dwelled on this very well. It also had to deal with the humiliation of having to leave West Africa in the conditions that we know. This is quite interesting because in France, this very important issue has gone completely under the radar, I would say, because, you know, there's so much happening. There was the war in Ukraine, there was the war in Gaza, but this is something, of course, in leading in military and civilian circles, it's something which has to be taken into the calculation about how the security and defense model of France has to evolve. But so we have now, of course, the economic shock of the war on both our economies, and probably a shock which is stronger on the German economy than on the French one. And we also have another factor, which is that we have two leaders, the Chancellor and the French President, who are weak politically at home, both because of their different reasons. One, the problems with the coalition, the other one doesn't have a majority in parliament. But this is that none of them has a strong domestic political base to rely on or to take bold initiative. So and now, so they openly clash on how to support Ukraine, which I agree with Nico is a pity, because on the goal they agree. There's no difference on the goal, which is that Ukraine has to be supported and has to win this war, but they clash on how to achieve this goal. So where do we go from here? The French Foreign Minister Stéphane Séjourné recently said in an interview that France and Germany agree on 80% of the issues, which I find, I think that probably wanted to be reassuring. I find it a bit worrying, because the 20% maybe of the agenda may be the most important things, namely Ukraine. But I think this there is a reckoning now that this has gone too far. I think in Paris there are, and probably in Berlin, since we have this meeting on Friday tomorrow, there is an acknowledgement that more efforts have to be made to mend fences and to improve this relationship. For a while, I thought, because of the evolution of the intra-European dynamics, I thought maybe this Franco-German axis is not so, or tandem is not so crucial anymore, because so many initiatives now come from the east or from the north, as we see with the Czech initiative, with Estonia, with Kaja Kallas also being a force of proposition and so. But when you think of it and when you talk to our partners, our European partners, I think they still see the Franco-German tandem as very important. And what is lacking at the moment is that there are they may work on their bilateral relationship, but what is lacking is the power of initiative, of joint initiative. Always within the EU, important initiatives started with a Franco-German either proposal or green light together, a joint one. And this and both the two countries together haven't been pushing recently any joint initiative. Probably the last one was the recovery package during the COVID crisis. And this is, I think, what is lacking. Now, we'll see what happened tomorrow. It's very interesting that the polls are now called for help. It is a new dimension, I think, because, of course, with this new government in Warsaw, there's more hope of having a fruitful triangular relationship. But we also have to be careful that France and Germany both have its own agenda on the relationship with Poland. So I think it will be important to really have a joint political effort and strong political will to repair this relationship and look forward together.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Very interesting. We have already sort of passed the 30 minutes line, but I would like to put quick questions to our panelists just before we open. But please have your questions ready and raise your hand if you already have something in mind you would like to put to our panel. Jakob, in before this, sort of in the run-up to this big split, we also sort of heard from the Chancellor in particular that the French sort of military help to Ukraine was so much more deficient, also so much smaller. According to the Kiel Institute, it's millions rather than billions, whereas the German sort of amount is sort of taxed somewhere between 18 and 20 billion, I believe. The French have said no, that's wrong. Actually, our support is worth something like 4 billion. Is that still? Do you think this is now overcome with this sort of big fight, and now we are sort of getting together again, or is it continuing to be an issue? That's probably also a question for Nico Lange. But Jakob first, please.
No, I don't think it's overcome. It has been a huge problem for months now. I think it stems from fundamental differences within the French and German strategic culture as well. I think nobody in Paris would have wanted to communicate so openly about weapon deliveries to Ukraine. I think that these lists and the transparency and the public discussion, the media discussion that we have seen in Germany is something that is very strange to many in France. The fact that the Institut für Weltwirtschaft in Kiel has been so important in the public discussion has forced the French to react at a certain point. The French National Assembly published a report on their own numbers that contradicted the Kiel numbers. Now the French government has communicated their own numbers for the first time that are sensibly higher than what the Kiel Institute gives to the French. But I think fundamentally the French are not happy at all with this kind of transparency, which goes against this concept of strategic ambiguity, perhaps the fact that they do not want Russia to know everything they deliver. But, and this goes back to what Sylvie just said on the interior pressure on both Macron and Scholz, I think that there's a new understanding in Paris that in Germany, the Chancellor needs this kind of transparency and needs to communicate on weapon deliveries, or seems to think that he needs that for the German debate. And so I think it's a good sign that the French are now communicating on their side, and it's probably good for Ukraine as well, because there's a certain sense in comparing these numbers, and if Ukraine can make the most of it, I think it's a good point.
Thank you very much. Nico Lange.
Well, maybe just a little bit frank, but let's be clear here. I think the statement about ground troops on the day of the summit was not a good statement at a bad moment in time, and it's a mistake to interpret approach of strategic ambiguity into this. But in general, I think this number discussion is not helpful to Ukraine. I think Christian Mölling rightfully has coined the phrase of a beauty contest, and that is, I mean, it's a domestic discussion. Oh, look, we did a lot. Why are the others not doing something? It's a purely domestic debate. It's not focused on what is actually helping Ukraine to win the war. I think it is true that Italy, France, and Spain, with the industrial backbone they have, could do more in quantity for Ukraine. On the other hand, France has decided, for example, to deliver Scalp Ege cruise missiles that are in quality extremely important to the way the Ukrainians are fighting, and made a big difference when it comes to Crimea, the Black Sea area, being able to ship grain again from Odessa port. So it's difficult to just judge this by numbers, and there's also stuff I think we don't see, and it's good that we are not discussing everything out in the open. To move this forward, I think it's extremely important to focus back on Ukraine and to have a meaningful initiative, and that's what I think is the best way to move forward tomorrow, or at least in the next weeks. And a meaningful initiative could be something like extended air defense for Ukraine, and like at least the beginning of a discussion in the context of the bilateral security assistance agreements. How do security agreements and security guarantees for Ukraine look like in the future? Because everybody understands a European security order and long-term security for Ukraine must be part of achieving peace. And I think there the German-French position, of course, is extremely important. And if France now is more open to inviting Ukraine into NATO, and US and Germany are blocking it, there is, I think, a discussion to be had for the next months until the Washington summit to move closer together. And I remember many points in history where between Germany and France there were contradictory positions, but for the overarching interest, in the end, both of them said we have to do this together and we have to find a common way. And I think for the future security of Ukraine, there is such a moment where they have to find a common position. It's not sustainable if on NATO membership on Ukraine, Germany and France will continue to have totally separate positions. They have to move closer together. But I think that's strategically extremely important.
Thank you very much, Nico Lange. And maybe I put a question which, the political editor of Deutsche Welle, Michaela Küfner, asked me to put to Sylvie, and this brings us back to what Nico Lange just said. what is if the leadership, the European leadership, Chancellor Scholz is showing, is this sort of meeting the expectations of the French? Or you said earlier that there's a sort of sense of competition. How does Paris see Scholz playing out this role on the European level?
Well, I think following up on what Nico said, I think a very good initiative would be for the three, Scholz, Tusk, and Macron to go together to Kiev. Make this visit together, and that would be, even though they have differences, okay, the French and the British send their Scalp and Storm Shadow long-range missiles to Ukraine. Okay, they're comfortable with it. Germany may not be so comfortable, but it's giving something else. I mean, that's what the Ukrainians actually, that's what President Zelensky says. He says he's happy to take whatever we can give him. So each country with its specificities and its culture and its means. But politically, then I think it would be really a very positive sign to go together there and show this. I mean, they did this not with Poland, but you remember in June 22, when Macron, Scholz, and Draghi and the Romanian president went together to Kiev and announced that they were in favor of opening negotiations with giving the candidate status to Ukraine, to the European Union. That was a very powerful move, and I think it's the time now to do something similar again, and definitely France and Germany should do it together.
Thank you very much. Again, please raise your hand and put your question directly to the panel. It makes this exchange always more lively. But since I see no raised hand, I will sort of move on to the chat and try to summarize three of the questions which have been put there. David Fouquet is asking about whether these individual bilateral security agreements various countries are in the process of signing with Ukraine or have already signed, whether there's a coordination element to it, whether it's within NATO or within the EU. That probably goes to Nico Lange in the first place. And Matthias Böhm is asking about examples of current or recent Franco-German projects, either to infuse the EU or European integrations, or just on the bilateral level. Can you think of anything maybe that's in the pipeline? Also, my quick answer to that would be probably no. And then there's Cory Hanke sort of asking about this something Nico Lange has alluded to, this SPD social democrat idea in Germany to position Scholz as a Friedenskanzler, as a chancellor for peace. What kind of effects this will have? Maybe we go through the panel and you can pick what you want to address. Maybe starting with Nico Lange on that moment, and then we have got two raised hands, which I much appreciate. Nico Lange, please.
On maybe just a little bit further on security guarantees and bilateral security assistance agreements. All of the agreements that have been signed so far, I think there are 6 of them for now, they have a consulting mechanism. So in the case Russia attacks Ukraine again, I mean, this is talking about a hypothetical state after this war, there will be a consulting mechanism, I think in the German-Ukrainian agreement and in the French-Ukrainian agreement, both of it is within 24 hours. But interestingly, those are bilateral agreements, so it's a bilateral consulting. It's not a multilateral consulting with all of the partners. But still, it is there. But there is, of course, a discussion to be had. If you have 32 partners of Ukraine agreed on a consulting mechanism, how do the 32 partners agree between themselves on how to proceed with this? And of course, consulting is not enough. So what is the real reaction to a further escalation by Russia within the framework of the security assistance agreements? And I think what we have to talk about is pre-positioning of material at the western borders of Ukraine, categories of weapons that are defined so that we can say, in the case Russia is escalating further, then we do the next step and move this material into Ukraine and go forward. And I think this has to be coordinated by Germany, by France, by other partners. At the same time, that's why I mentioned NATO in the same context. I mean, Ukraine is an EU candidate for membership, and Ukraine, I think, needs to be invited to start accession talks to NATO. I know that the political discussion is very far away from that, but I think it's a necessity to move into that direction if we want to end this war and come to peace. And within this discussion, of course, there are many discussions that involve Germany and France as European NATO powers. I mean, what would application of Article 5 mean in terms of NATO force posture in Europe? What does it mean for air defense and for missile defense, for maritime posture in the Black Sea? So there are I think, a lot of discussions to be had to move forward on that front. And it would be better, that's the main point. I think Sylvie made the same point. It would be better to do this coordinated between Germany and France in every step and not just every one of them individually with Ukraine. And going there together could be a good next step. But make sure that in the train going to Kiev, everybody has the same quality of a cabin and everybody is sitting on equal positions on the table so that there's no discussion who is more important than the other. That seems to be. So maybe Donald Tusk can moderate that again. On the Friedenskanzler debate, I think we have to just acknowledge that the SPD, looking into the polls and facing the European Parliament elections, has the feeling it has its back to the wall, and it's resorting to all kind of measures because having its back to the wall. This is, of course, very difficult because this kind of electoral tactics, and I think the political communication and the wordings that sometimes when I hear those interviews in radio, intellectually, I feel not being taken seriously as somebody listening to this kind of communication. I mean, it's really like a construction set of political phrases that are now used to communicate with the auditorium in Germany. I do not think it's increasing the electoral potential, and it's watering down the meaningful debate on helping Ukraine into some kind of communication party head office talking points, which is not helping Ukraine at all. And if we have, I think, more weeks of that, it will bring the debate to an extremely ugly level. But let's face it, I don't want to be too long, but let's face it, I think the elections to the European Parliament will be a significant moment in domestic German policy. And after that, we will have difficult discussions in this country, because there will be at least 2 points. One point is, can Scholz stay Chancellor if his party achieves 13 or 14% at the European Parliament elections? That's where the panic is, I think, coming from. And the second debate will be, how is the country changing if the AfD gets more than 20% of the vote at the European Parliament elections? I think that is what we see in the debates is already a projection of what will happen after European Parliament elections in Germany.
Many thanks. Jakob, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly, because there's a lot of raised hands now, but I think that the pressure is also on Macron. I mean, regarding the Friedenskanzler or Social Democrats as a Friedenspartei in Germany discussion, there's a certain politicization of the support for Ukraine in France too. It's coming from another direction. Macron and his party try to frame the right-wing extremists from Rassemblement National for being too close to Putin, for being against supporting Ukraine in the future. But it's a very risky game since you see on the political fringes in France, both on the left and the right, this picking up of this topic, picking up of the comments of Macron on ground troops in Ukraine. The other day I saw posters in Paris saying we don't want to die for Donbass. So there's a real risk to my mind. We will see if the Rassemblement National, which is currently leading and by far, I mean, they are 12 percentage points in front of Macron's party for the European elections. If they decide to pick up on this topic and say, we are facing a French president who can't be re-elected, who is putting our citizens at risk, who wants to escalate the conflict, you see that on the fringes. But I think Macron will have to deal with this risk and with this discussion just as much as Scholz is doing, from maybe not from a position of weakness comparable to Scholz. I mean, the fact that Toni Hofreiter and Norbert Röttgen wrote this op-ed a couple of days ago would be absolutely unthinkable in France. The fact that a coalition partner writes an op-ed in Le Monde and criticizes the president is really unthinkable in the French system. But I think there's still a lot of pressure on Macron at the moment stemming from interior politics.
Thank you very much. Sylvie, do you want to come in? Otherwise, I would...
Yeah, very quickly. The European election is also very important for France. The debate in Parliament over the last 2 days over the security agreement with Ukraine showed that there was quite a lot of a fairly good, strong consensus on support to Ukraine and a strong opposition on sending troops. But at the same time, it's not this issue. Nobody's talking about sending troops or dying for Donbass at the moment. So I think this, maybe we can keep this debate for later if it arises. Just one thing about NATO. There is something that I think France and Germany have to work on, and it's about the possibility that Trump is re-elected. And there we have another very possible source of tension between France and Germany, because the outlook on, as I said, is different. And I think it would be very useful to work on this before it happens and try to be prepared.
Thank you very much. We've got 9 minutes left. We've got 4 raised hands. I'll go through them, and then the panel has the last sort of chance to respond to the questions which have been raised. Let's start with Helmut Hoffmann. Please introduce yourself and put the question to the panel, please.
Yes, good morning. I'm a retired German Foreign Service official. 2 comments, if I may, and panelists may wish to comment on my comments. Nico Lange suggested that the German public was not unsympathetic to sending ground troops to Ukraine. I would challenge that. I think it's absolutely untrue. It's not only the SPD parliamentary faction which Scholz has to care about. I think there is no appetite at all. And I would submit there is no appetite in most of the EU member states, including France, for that. Second comment on the background of Macron's proposal. Isn't it the case that this has precisely to do with this beauty contest, as it was called? Paris was furious about this debate, which came up only a few weeks ago, that France was delivering much less than Germany. And it's so obvious. The best way to drown out this debate is to come up with something really big, and particularly something really big which you don't have to actually implement, because everybody knows that the United States would not be in favor. And if this is the case, there will be no NATO troops on the ground. And the second thing was, for Macron, he knew perfectly well, he must have known and anticipated that Scholz would come out against this. So I think this is really more the background to this whole proposal rather than other considerations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the first point is a bit of a misunderstanding, but we'll come to that. Karin Finkenzeller, please.
Karin Finkenzeller, correspondent for German Business Weekly Wirtschaftswoche. Actually, Jakob Rose said that he will be interested whether the right-wing party or the left-wing parties in France would raise the question, and well, they already have. I was in Marseille at the first of 10 campaigns for the European Parliament elections of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. That was on March 3rd. And of course, they talked about it. And again, I asked myself whether Macron, with his statement, he was not only ambiguous towards Russia or towards his partners in Europe, but unfortunately, he was also very ambiguous to his own people. And as Jakob Rose also mentioned it, Macron's party is way behind the Rassemblement National for the European elections. And with this statement, I'm so afraid he has even more weakened his party's positions for the European elections. And the right-wing party, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, they will win these elections by far, because Jordan Bardella, he's a pop star. And they will not end with the European elections. And when we talk today whether France will have better or weaker relationships with Germany, we all have to face that within a certain time there will no longer be Macron and Scholz talking to each other, but Jordan Bardella or Marine Le Pen and somebody else.
Thank you very much for that point. Milanic, please.
Oops. Thank you. I see we are running out of time, so very quickly. Question to Paris, first of all, about Weimar Triangle. So Sylvie, when you know this, when you discuss Weimar Triangle in Berlin, it's a reflex now. It's an understanding that you cannot sort of think about European Eastern policy and future of joint policy towards Ukraine without bringing the East on board, and Poland is the biggest proxy you have. When I talk to French diplomats, they are not so convinced, and they are actually asking, why do we need in Franco-German discussion when it's so heavy now and so much misunderstanding? Why do we need Poland there? Do you hear this kind of doubt in Paris? My second question is related to this. Donald Tusk is coming from Washington, D.C. He went there together with President Andrzej Duda, which is a very important domestic sort of statement. And my third point is about a reminder that there is domestic politics everywhere. So, Jakob, you mentioned Robert Fico, Prime Minister of my home country, Slovakia. He was not originally invited to Paris. He imposed himself there. I think he was rewarded by Élysée because he behaved well on the EU level. He was more constructive than Viktor Orban. And then he used it completely for domestic politics. Rather than, hints to Moscow that you alluded to, I would point out to the fact that there are presidential elections in Slovakia in 2 weeks, where his candidate needs to win to have all layers of power. And the counterpart, the opponent, is Ivan Korčok, former foreign minister. They are trying to frame him as somebody who is a candidate of war, whereas they are trying to be the party of peace.
Sorry, we're running out of time. That's your point. Thank you very much. And Klaus Wittmann, please.
Klaus Wittmann, former general. I teach contemporary history at Potsdam University. And on what Nico Lange said about the Friedenskanzler, I have two more or less rhetorical questions. Is it not very clear how afraid Russia is of the Taurus cruise missile and that its resulting threats have the desired effect? And secondly, is the Chancellor not to some extent arousing the angst in the German people to which he then refers?
Thank you very much. Well, we have got 2 minutes, which is not very much, but we'll try our best. Maybe you run a little bit over. Let's start with Sylvie and then go to Nico Lange and then finally to Jakob.
Yeah, for the sake of time, I will just answer Milan's question about Poland and the Weimar Triangle. I think the French do put a lot of weight on the relationship with Poland. I mean, this triangular relationship is complicated, but there is a lot of hope here that Poland will be a major player, and the fact that Donald Tusk has been the president of the European Council, of course, gives him more weight and more expertise to try to be an important actor. So then how does this relate to each, how does Poland, as I said, each country has its own agenda with each other. So it's a bit complicated, but I think it improves the dynamic. It does improve the dynamic. And we see that the eastern part of Europe, Central Europe, eastern part is more and more is a more and more active voice in the European Union. So this has to be acknowledged.
Many thanks. Nico Lange, please.
On the public opinion and the German Chancellor, I think the ground troops debate in Germany is pretty much answering a question that nobody has ever asked. So it's like a straw man argument. And I did not say what you said. I think what we see is that there has been strong public support for helping Ukraine more that would have allowed the government to do much more than it did, especially in the initial phase of the war. And it was the strong public support and the public pressure and the published opinion pressure that forced the government to get more dynamic on helping Ukraine. And still now you see the opinion polls that are actually going up when it comes to the question helping Ukraine more. But there is no discussion about ground troops in Germany, so why making the point to exclude it if there is no discussion at all? And that leads to my second point. I think it's at least a brave statement by a chancellor in parliament to say, oh, the others who are demanding more weapons for Ukraine, they produce fear in German society. If I am myself the chancellor giving an interview to Spiegel early in the war, where I helped creating fears about nuclear escalation and the nuclear bomb being used for delivering Marder infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. At least it's not honest to have a discussion like that. I'm more comfortable talking about what is needed in Ukraine, but talking about German domestic discussion, key problem seems to me to be that the chancellor, who was never elected SPD chairperson, has always difficulties finding majorities in his own party and his own parliamentary group for a more robust policy when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And I mean, if you remember the current Taurus debate, it was announced by Mr. Mützenich that very soon the Chancellor will declare himself on Taurus. I think that says something about the domestic discussions in this party.
Thank you very much. And Jakob, final word.
Well, just very rapidly, I mean, looking at these discussions on the Friedenskanzler and Scholz's relationship to SPD from France, it's striking to see how Olaf Scholz is communicating increasingly directly with the German public and with the electorate, where in the German system he's elected by the Bundestag in the Bundestag, which is a huge difference to the French president who's directly elected by popular will. But I think Scholz knows that he has lost, in a sense, the Bundestag. He has lost his coalition partners to a certain degree, Strack-Zimmermann in the Defense Committee, Hofreiter in the European Committee. And so now he's always in his speeches, yesterday again, appealing directly to the German public with this message, I'm hearing you, I'm hearing your fears, and I'm the Chancellor of Balances, which is a very French way, in a sense, to communicate in the constitutional system. So that's just an observation, and it will be interesting to follow up on this in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. This will, of course, go on and continue to occupy us. This morning, there's another vote in the German parliament about the Taurus delivery or not, another sort of critical moment for the German government. And tomorrow, as we've said many times now, there's the Franco-German Polish Weimar Triangle meeting in Berlin, where we have many hopes that this will be constructive and put things forward. And I'm very side with Nico Lange here. As the most important thing, of course, is supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia's war of aggression. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Sylvie Kauffmann, Nico Lange, and Jakob Ross. Thank you for joining us this morning, and looking forward to seeing you soon again at a German Council on Foreign Relations morning briefing. Have a very good morning.